sing, the God of the mountains is the God of the valley. And I love mountains. I love mountains. I don't always love valleys. And it's amazing to me sometimes how quickly I can forget that the God of the mountains is the God of the valleys. That it can be very easy in the valleys to forget that God is God, that God is reigning, that God is sovereign, that God is control of creation. We're continuing this week in our series from the tortured prophets department, and we're going to walk a minute with Elijah, the prophet. And Elijah is a prophet who had a very quick descent from the mountaintop to the valleys. He has a very impressive resume if you look at his life and his story. He's one of two people from the Old Testament that actually participated in raising someone from the dead. Only two people in the Old Testament had that experience, Elijah and Elisha. He's one of two people from the scriptures that we're told did not die. Enoch, it says in Genesis, was no more. We're just told that he was no more, and we're told that Elijah left in a chariot of fire off into the whirlwind, and that's what we know of the end of his story. So a very unique experience in that regard. He was mistaken in the New Testament for both. People thought John the Baptist was Elijah, had returned since he didn't die, maybe he could come back. And people thought Jesus was Elijah at one point in time. He was only two of Old Testament people who attended the Transfiguration. Remember when Jesus went up to the top of the mount with Peter, James, and John, and they saw Elijah and Moses and Jesus all were together in their transfigured, in their resurrected form, or whatever it was going on in that context. Elijah was one of the people there, so he's kind of on par with Moses in terms of his significance in the kingdom of God. And I like to think of Elijah as, in addition to all those things, the father of trash talking. We'll come to that in a minute. Elijah, in his story, he droughts onto the scene. Typically, we think of people storming onto the scene, but Elijah actually didn't storm onto the scene. His opening act, his opening prophecy was to go to King Ahab and say, "Hey, Ahab, there's going to be a drought for several years until God says that it's going to rain again." His prophecy is to King Ahab, and all of Israel's kings were bad. King Ahab was the worst of all the bad kings. It says in 1 Kings 21, verse 25, that there was never anyone like Ahab who sold himself to do evil in the eyes of the Lord. That of all the bad kings, he was the worst of the worst of the worst. And it tells us that he was the worst in part because he was urged on by Jezebel, his wife. That she had a part in his being the worst. Jezebel was a heathen princess from a pagan country and a devoted worshiper of Baal, one of the prominent idols of her day. She was a woman who was vengeful. She was manipulative. She was cruel. She was controlling. She had a man killed because Ahab wanted his vineyard. He said no. She said yes. And she had the guy killed so that she could give the vineyard to her husband. She was a leader in leading Israelite people into immorality and idol worship. And it says in Revelation chapter 2 that by her teaching she misleads my servants into sexual immorality and the eating of food sacrificed to idols. Jezebel was the Jezebel from whom all future Jezebels, we don't say that anymore. I don't think it's politically correct, but when I was a kid, they would say, "Oh, she's a real Jezebel," right? This was the Jezebel that all the people were referring to when they talked about Jezebels. she initiated a campaign to kill all the prophets of Israel. During his 22-year reign, under the influence of his wife, Israel spiraled into rapid decline. Elijah's prophecies, in many respects, were pretty run-of-the-mill for prophets. Many of them talked about, hey, there's going to be a drought, there's going to be a famine, there's not going to be any rain, now the rain's going to come. A lot of them talked about the kings that were bad and the idol worship and how the people were going to be judged and how the kings were going to be judged because of their idolatry and the worship of these other gods. A lot of them talked about what was coming as a result of their injustices because they were neglecting the needs of the widow, the orphan, the poor, oppressing the foreigners. They were not doing, Israel was breaking their covenant promises. So in many respects, Elijah was kind of run-of-the-mill in those things. He had kind of one interesting story is during the famine, during the drought and the famine, he was told to go meet this widow, and she was kind of down to her last jar of oil and flour, and he had her make bread and feed him, and then she had if you go to some restaurants, they have bottomless fries. Right? That means you just keep getting more and more and more. This is like the first bottomless jar of oil and flour that kept making bread and bread over and over and over again until the drought was over. So you can thank him for your bottomless fries. So a lot of things, kind of just the stuff that prophets do. But Elijah's climb to the top of the mountain came on Mount Carmel. Maybe you've heard this story before, that there's all these prophets of Baal that have been risen up under the permission of and indiscretions of King Ahab and the influence of Jezebel. And so Israel is worshiping these other prophets, these other gods, and not God. And so Elijah calls all of the people of Israel together and all of the prophets of Baal together. 450 prophets of Baal, 400 other prophets of Asherah, and he invites them to the first barbecue. Says, meet me on Mount Carmel. All of us are going to come together. And he brought all of Israel together, and he stood in front of them, and he says, how much longer will you waver, hobbling between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if God is God, then follow him. And the people were silent. No response. So he lays down the gauntlet. He says, here's the deal. Here's the challenge. Here's what we're going to do. All of you prophets of Baal and Asherah, I want you to build an altar. And get your cow and cut it up and put it on the altar. And I'm going to build an altar. And I'm going to take the altar and I'm going to put the cow, I'm going to put the sacrifice on there. And after we build our two altars, what's going to happen is you're going to cry out to your gods, and I'm going to cry out to the Lord. And whichever God lights the fire, you build the altar, we'll build the altars, but God lights the fire. Whoever lights the fire, that's God. And he invites the prophets of Baal to go first. They come out, they build their altar, and set it up. They cry out to Baal, it says, from morning to noon, asking him to light the fire. Nothing happened. This is where the trash talking starts. Now, personally, I'm not a fan of trash talkers, like in sports and stuff. I'm one of those that's like, let your game do the talking. Just go out and play the dumb game, and if you're better than them, you win. If you're not better than them, you lose. You don't need to talk about how much you better you are before the game is played. When it comes to prophets, I'm kind of into trash talking. I mean, this is, I don't know. You be the judge. So they're crying out to God, to the gods of Baal, and nothing's happening. And so Elijah says, maybe you need to shout louder. He scoffed. For surely he's a god. Perhaps he is daydreaming. Right? Man, you just need to bring him back into reality. Or perhaps he's relieving himself. Didn't you really just say that? Like, maybe he's going to the bathroom? Or maybe he is away on a trip. Maybe he's taking a vacation. You need to, bring him back into the right territory. Or maybe he's just taking a nap. You need to wake him up. Spurred on by Elijah's taunting, they shout louder. They cry out louder. They start cutting themselves with knives and swords, which was their custom. They rave from morning to evening, and still nothing happened. So Elijah takes his turn. He prepares his altar, puts the meat on top of it. And then he says, there's some really large jars over there. I want you to take the jars, fill 4 jars up, and I want you to pour the water on top of the altar. And he digs a trench around it, and they go and they get the water, and they fill it up, and they dump it on top. And then he says, now do it again. And so they get the 4 jars, and they fill them up again, and they dump it on top. And then he says, and now do it again. And you kind of get where this is going, like he's soaking, and it's like, he's showing off. He continues kind of this taunting thing. And he fills it up again, and he pours it out. And so it says that the water is just soaking down the altar, filling up the trench that he's dug around the altar. And then he prays, "O Lord, prove today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant. Prove that I have done all that you command. Answer me so that the people will know that you are God and you have brought them back to yourself." Elijah prays, fire flashes from heaven, comes down, burns up the sacrifice on the altar, burns up all the wood on the altar, burns up all the stones on the altar, and licks up the water out of the trench around the altar. And the people fall on their face and they cry out to God. The Lord, He is God. At that point, all the false prophets, the 850 of them who are gathered there, each of them meets their Maker, and the Lord triumphs. The Lord proves that He is the God. From there, Ahab goes home to his lovely wife Jezebel, and he's licking his wounds from what has happened on Mount Carmel. And Jezebel's not having it. Not on my watch. She vows, she says, if Elijah is not dead by this time tomorrow, may the gods of Baal treat me ever so severely. It's like, it doesn't really seem like much of a threat at this point because the gods of Baal really haven't proven to be that great of gods or gods at all. But that's what she says. I'm going to kill him by this time tomorrow. And it says they gave this message to Elijah, and he was afraid and fled for his life. And my question is, what happened? What happened to this guy who was boldly standing on top of a mountain saying, whose God is the real God? My God's the real God. I got God. Yes, I do. You got God. No, you don't. Whose God lights the fire? My God's the God. Everybody sees it. And now he's running for his life. What happened? Well, if you follow him now on his journey, he runs into the wilderness. He gets a day's range into the wilderness, fleeing Jezebel and her threat. And it says that he falls down under a broom tree and he prays. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, great! That's exactly what I want. Well, this is actually what he prays. I have had enough, Lord. Take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors who have already died. He has gone from the mountaintop to rock bottom. And then it says he crashes passes out, falls asleep. But he doesn't die. It says in the passage that he is then touched by an angel. And the angel wakes him up, gives him dinner. Elijah goes back to sleep, wakes him up again, gives him another meal, says to him, this is in 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 7, "Get up, Elijah, and eat, for the journey is too much for you." The first thing that God says to Elijah after he's run for his life from the showdown on Mount Carmel through this angel is he gives him food and rest. Get up and eat, he says, because the journey is too much for you. He says, you are too physically spent, worn out, exhausted, empty to handle what's come at you. Somehow, in this story, part of Elijah's collapse is the fact his spiritual collapse, his loss of faith, is that he is just physically at the end of his rope. Now, I'm looking in this story for lessons. What can we learn in our own journey about mountaintops and valleys and how to walk in this space of saying that the God of the mountains is also the God of the valley? And that when we face the hardships and the challenges and the struggles, how do we stay in that place of confidence and faith and trust so we're not running for our lives? Is this part of the story? That we can come to a place where part of the reason we just are not holding it together is just because we've come to the end of ourselves. That what we need is not more work. What we need is rest and restoration. Part of me thinks, no, that's not really part of the story, right? But think about this. Remember Peter? Jesus takes the disciples to the Garden of Gethsemane on the night that he's going to be betrayed. And he goes and prays, and the disciples fall asleep. And Jesus had told Peter that he was going to deny him 3 times that night. And he comes to Peter, and Peter's asleep, and he says to him, "Keep watch and pray so that you do not fall into temptation." And then he says this, because the spirit is willing, but the body is weak. Jesus says to Peter, you know what, Peter, you're not going to fail. You're not going to fall into temptation because you're not willing to do the right thing. It's not because you don't have enough faith. Because you've come to the end of yourself, because you are exhausted. You are worn out. You are broken down. You are beat down. Keep watch and pray. Your spirit is willing. Your body is weak. Remember Psalm 23. David prays, "The Lord is my shepherd. I don't need to want for anything. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters." What is the first thing David says the shepherd does when he comes to care for him? Rest, replenishment, renewal, restoration. We are finite, dependent creatures. And like they said in the Snickers commercial, you're not you when you're hungry. You're not you when you're tired. You're not you when you're run down, when you're exhausted. that when we ignore our human limitations, we simultaneously exhaust our own resources and neglect our need for God's provision. If we're doing it on our own, we're wasting ourselves away, and we're not looking to God who replenishes us. We're living in our own strength and our own resources and not drawing upon the life of God and the love of God and the Spirit of God living in us and restoring us and replenishing us. It matters. Our physical maintenance of these vessels that God has given us are necessary for us to live the life of God in the world. What we do with our bodies matters to our spirits. Elijah travels 40 days to Mount Horeb from there, spends the night in a cave. The Lord said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah complains, "I have zealously served the Lord God Almighty, but the people of Israel have broken their covenant with you, torn down your altars, killed every one of your prophets. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." God tells Elijah to go stand out on the side of the mountain, and he says, "I'm going to show up." So Elijah goes up to the mountain. He's there, and God puts on a show with earth, wind, and fire. Not the 70s and 80s popular rock group band, like actually a windstorm, an earthquake, and fire. And after the firestorm, it says, there was a gentle whisper. Elijah wrapped his face in a cloak and went out and stood on the entrance of the cave. God again says to Elijah, "What are you doing here?" Elijah gives him the same response. "I did my job. It didn't work." It sounds a whole lot like Jeremiah, doesn't it? "I did what you asked me to do. It didn't work. The people are not responding. I'm the only one left, and now they're going to kill me too. I'm the last Mohican, and I'm going down." Elijah makes two assumptions based on his limited perspective. The first assumption is this. He says, "I am the only one left. It's just me now." And the first thing, it's an assumption, again, based on his perspective, that God simply says, "It's not true, Elijah. You are not alone in the world. In fact," he says, "I've reserved 7,000 others in Israel who have not bowed down to Baal." You're not just not the last Mohican, Elijah. You're not even one of the last 7,000. But a lie we believe to be true, I've said this many times, a lie we believe to be true affects us as if it were true. And the belief that we are alone in the world is common, and it's debilitating. It's true to an extent, right? That no two people and no two stories are the same. We're all unique. We have different experiences. We don't all have the same experiences, and the experiences we have, we don't experience them the same way. They don't affect us the same way. But they do evoke common physical responses, common emotional responses, common relational responses. Right? We don't all experience them the same way, but we all experience in these things, we experience loss. That's a common experience. We experience grief. We experience betrayal, anger, fear, doubt, shame. So while we don't experience all the same things, there are so many commonalities. It evokes the same things inside of us. And when we believe that we're alone, it isolates us from everyone else. We have no allies in our story then, because no one else can understand. No one else knows what I'm going through. No one else has it as bad as I do. I talked to you a few weeks ago about former colleague Jerry Sitzer, who lost his wife, mother, and daughter in a tragic car accident. And he talked about, in a sense, a lot of people looked at his story as like, losing someone is horrible, but losing three people, 3 generations in one moment, one instant, that's a different kind of loss. And he makes a very strong case to say we cannot compare our losses. And if we come to that point where we're saying, I'm the only one, and what I'm experiencing is worse than everybody else's, so no one can understand me, no one can identify with me, he makes this statement. He says, when we make ourselves the ultimate victim, that we indulge ourselves in our pain, it becomes our whole world. It becomes our identity, our reality. And then he says, and we gain a strange kind of pleasure in our misery that locks us into that place and never lets us out. In community, we meet people, not have had the same experience, but have common experiences, emotions, feelings, events that come out of those experiences, that bind us together, that connect us in our humanity. And we can learn from other people and their stories and how they've come out of or come through struggles and challenges. We can find encouragement. They call them support groups, right? Because they support people in grief, in loss, in addiction, in divorce, in cancer, financial struggles, right? That we do life together. And when we don't, we fall into this trap of saying, it's just me, and I'm alone in it. And we lose hope. We isolate ourselves. Elijah's like, I'm the only one, God. And God says, no, Elijah, you're not. You are not alone. It's a false assumption. You're only looking at what you can see. The second thing that Elijah says, his second assumption is, and they're going to kill me too. He assumes that he knows the end of the story. This is where it's going. All the evidence is, all the other prophets have been killed. Now she's after me. She got them. She's batting 1,000. I'm next in line. I'm going down. After the Earth, Wind, and Fire concert, Elijah hears a gentle whisper. And so you have this windstorm, and earthquake, and fire. This display of phenomenal cosmic power that God gives to Elijah. And he said, you're running from Jezebel. Do you see what's at my disposal? Do you see the resources that are available to me? But after each one of these, after the windstorm and after the earthquake and after the fire, it says, but God was not in those events. He was behind them, but he was not in them. And finally it says, and there was a gentle whisper. God comes to Elijah, not in a firestorm, an earthquake, or a windstorm, in a whisper. A whisper is the tone, the volume of intimacy. Right? If you want to talk to 1,000 people, you get a megaphone and you yell, you shout, and everybody hears it. But if you have a private, intimate conversation, you don't want anybody else to know. This is something that's deep, connected. A whisper. God comes to Elijah. Says, Elijah, I'm here. I am with you. You are not alone. And he doesn't actually speak to Elijah's concern about being killed. He does say, Elijah says, I'm alone. God says, you're not alone. Elijah says, and they're going to kill me too. God doesn't say, no, they're not going to kill you. What he does say is, go back. Go back to where you came from. Go back and anoint these other people, prophets and kings, for the jobs that are going to come to them. Go back and do your prophet thing. Do what prophets do. Because Elijah, you're not done. You're not done with your work. And you can't be doomed. This can't be the end of your story. Because you're not done with what I have given you to do. Right? If you're sitting here today, you're watching online today, and you're listening, and you're hearing, and like you put your hand in front of your face and you feel like something coming out, like feels like breath. If you like put your hand on your chest and your heart's still beating, you do not know the end of your story. What I can tell you for sure is, you're not done. The end of the story has not been, your story has not been written yet for you to know. Now, God knows the end of your story, but not you. And false assumptions, lies that we believe to be true, affect us as if we are true. And when we limit ourselves to only what we can see and the range of our sight and our knowledge of what's going on around us, we write God out of the story. And we go from mountaintops to rock bottom in a moment. So, my lessons, you can decide for yourself, as I walk away from Elijah's experiences, I'm challenged to remember that I'm a human being. And that when I'm tired and hungry, I'm not me. Because that's the way God made me. What he didn't make us to do is to draw life and strength from him. To trust that when we rest, that he continues to reign. That he actually can do this thing without us. So we can take a break. We can, you know what, I'm going to do this today. We're going to, summertime is coming. I challenge you to go on vacation this summer. Californians are terrible vacationers. Like, you think vacation is Vegas. Think bigger. You don't have to go far. There's like way things more life-giving, closer. Rest, restoration, renewal. You are not alone. We were made for community. We were made for connection. We need each other by design. And your story is not over. God is not finished. And he's got things that he has prepared for you to do today. We go with God, we go together, and we go to the world to bring the life of God and the love of God to the people that he knows and loves and desires to know him. Lord, thank you for Elijah. God, I get that experience of standing on the mountaintop and feeling like you got the world by the tail because you got God right there with you. And in a moment, feeling like all is lost. Thank you for the fact that you met Elijah on Mount Carmel, in his confidence, in his faith, in his strength, but that you also met him on Mount Horeb, in his doubt, in his fear, in his weakness. God, I pray that by your Spirit, that you would do that for each one of us today in just the way that we need it uniquely. If we're standing on the mountaintop, praise you, Lord. If we're hiding in a cave on Mount Horeb, God, speak truth into our lives, to our limited perspective. Restore our hope. Reveal truth. Fill us with life. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.